Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Morena, koutou katoa. Welcome to you all to the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host, calling you from somewhere in France, and co-host
and
Peter
I'm
Bale.
Pierre Bale from Herne Bay. Now, Bernard, we've done this game before, but where in the world is Bernard Hickey?
Well, we're very lucky to be in a home exchange apartment in a place called Annecy, which is...
Well, I think we call it Annecy, don't we?
Annecy, exactly.
Annecy.
I have got to get my nasal action going. It is a wonderful place next to a lake, which we've already swum in 3 times. I've
Good.
had my
with clothes on, or with togs on, or without?
Togs. They wear togs here. It's very, and there's a lot of people. I guess in August, basically, it's a bath. This lake with lots and lots of people.
Did you know, Bernard, that you can't swim in public swimming pools in France in anything other than Speedos if you're a chap?
Really?
I know.
So I need to get some Speedos.
Don't I bring the best information to you?
I shall point this out to my lovely partner, Lynn, that I need a pair of Speedos.
Jesus Christ, that could be... Yeah,
bad karma. Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Well, it's true. When we went swimming, and it's just occurring to me now, Peter, thanks to this fantastic insight you've just given me, that I had wondered why there were so many pairs of Speedos. They seem very...
Well, they're compulsory, as I say, in public swimming pools. Now, the other thing you sent me the other day that I was super impressed by was a picture of not one but 2 1970s or 1980s Renault 4s driving past you on the motorway. Actually, it was quite impressive that they were driving past you, given that their top speed is about 85 kilometres an hour.
Well, luckily, I managed to get the picture because we were both at one of those stop signs, and it was a thrill. I have seen some new Renault 4 electric cars.
Oh, could I have photographs of those, please, possibly?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In the wild.
I think people possibly know that as my partner calls it, my one true love is in fact my Renault 4, 1984 Renault 4, which lives unfortunately in Spain, not in Auckland.
Yes, and also some Citroën Ami, these amazing bubble electric cars.
The new ones. Because if you look at the old Citroën Ami, Bernard, it's one of the ugliest, yet sort of, it's what
ugly,
we
beautiful.
In France call joli laid, which is beautiful ugly.
Yeah, beautiful ugly. No, there's plenty of that. I'm really enjoying having a couple of weeks off, and I really appreciate the space that subscribers have given me to do that. It's not normal, I suppose, if you're paying for a subscription for people to not get anything for a couple of weeks, but we'll be back again with articles from Monday. So
are you back on Monday?
Well, no. Producing articles for this.
Oh, I see. Well, don't burst a gasket, Bernard. I don't want you working too hard over there.
No.
And as you know, it gives you being away gives me a tiny bit of space to slightly expand the international section.
Yes.
And we've got a great section today. I wanted to talk. We sometimes talk about media, Bernard, and we're going to have Catherine Dyer on in a moment, so we'll get into climate. But so Saudi Arabia this week executed a journalist, Turki Al-Jasser. Presumably, we don't know, but presumably they beheaded him with a sword for tweeting about the royal family's corruption. And of course, that's 3 weeks after Trump was there saying, we're not going to preach to you anymore about, moral justice. Now, and this is a weird segue, and I don't mean to suggest that David Seymour would behead either of us. But David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party and former Deputy Prime Minister, current Deputy Prime Minister, just issued the most extraordinary fundraising email from which I get, as a paid-up member of ACT, not. And he's said the media have abused their power to edit, and we've taken away that power, which is all about his thing about having a camera when he's being interviewed. And he said, it's all about trust, which is important, and trust is a problem. But we talk about this regularly, and it is people like David, who I would like to get on, but I'd need to, because he's such a slippery little bugger. I'd like to, I'd need to. It would be like having soap on a rope if he was, in a shower, that he'd slip through your hands.
Yeah, David is
fewer and fewer people are watching the 6 o'clock news, listening to Morning Report, or sitting through. And this is the nasty bit. It's very Sean Plunkettish, actually. Mahingarangi Forbes' latest taxpayer-funded pseudo-documentary.
Which I'd recommend everyone watch, because
it is. I mean, we've talked many times before about David's extraordinary ability, Dave-O's extraordinary ability to go, as Jacinda had, to go direct, to use Facebook and so on. But this is really unpleasant.
Yeah, you love it how libertarians and liberals love it until it isn't in their favour, and then they don't love it. Yeah. No, it is a frustrating thing. I know David. I've had lots of great conversations with him. We've had him on the Kaka before, and I will make an extra effort to get him on. We'll point out that we have a very small audience.
Could you give me quite a lot of time, because
Sure.
like somebody's just vomited actually about the idea of being in the shower with David Seymour, but on our feed, Bernard. That's not just me. Shall I talk a little bit about what we've got on the show today?
Yes, please. It's a cracker, by the way.
What?
It's a cracker. It's a cracker of a show.
Well, let's see. We can't judge that. So Dr. Catherine Dyer will be on shortly, and we have an expanded international section with 3 terrific guests. We have an expert on Iran, a sharp critic of Israel, and our regular expert, Dr. Robert Patman. And what I would say, and I'll try to do that with the audience when these guys come on. What we try to do is not just give you what you can get from doing a web search. These are really insightful people, and we'll be asking them about their perspectives in a way that will hopefully be additive to your knowledge and thinking. And so we're going to deal with the international section will be predominantly about Israel, Iran, and also Robert, I hope, will give us a little bit of perspective on the New Zealand side of that, because he's just written an excellent piece in The Conversation about Christopher Luxon's, the Prime Minister, going to China, and the difficulties of doing that while embedded with the United States. And I suspect one way or another we have to have a view on Iran and Israel as well, which in a sense Winston Peters has done. So shall we move to climate rather than my book recommendation of the week, because otherwise I'll crowd out poor old Catherine.
Thank you. That's a fantastic preamble for the big events globally, which we need to talk about. But before we do that, it's great to have Catherine on to talk about the climate and a paper which I actually managed to have a look at this week. You know how it is when you've got a few moments, you go straight to the climate papers. And Catherine, tell us about this new one, which has had a look at the energy imbalance, the energy going out of the atmosphere and the energy coming into the atmosphere, and what that means for the sensitivity of the climate temperature increase. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, there's been a bit of a rush of papers coming out in the last couple of weeks, actually, but over the last few months as well, that have been looking at the increases in temperatures, particularly over the last few years, because they have been in excess of what the models suggested were going to happen. The last week we talked about a paper that looked at the loss of the satellites that are measuring Earth's energy imbalance. So we were talking about how, we had some really important information coming through about the energy imbalance doubling over the last 20 years, and how there needed to be more investment from NASA in order to put up new satellites, because the old ones, the ones that we're using at the moment, are coming towards the end of their life, and we could lose visibility over this sort of thing. But what has come out in the weeks since then, or last week, is the other side of that Earth's energy imbalance situation is, what does that mean for temperatures? Because, if you've got more energy coming into the system than you've got going out of the system, that's the imbalance there. then obviously that has an impact on temperatures. There was a paper that came out in the last week or so by Stefan Ramsdorff and who's the other author?
And another foreigner.
It's Grant Foster. No, I mean
Foster and Ramsdorff, that's right.
Yeah, we've got some great climate scientists actually.
For now.
Yeah, and so they picked up on that in terms of what it has meant for the temperature increase. And then using the numbers in that paper, another scientist, Leon Simons, who does a lot of work on aerosols and has co-authored papers with James Hansen, he looked at what what that paper had said is that the rate of warming has doubled from about 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade to 0.43, I think they said in that paper, so more than doubled over the last 20 years. And so Leon Simons took those numbers and he projected them out in a linear line into the future, saying, well, if that acceleration rate, if it continues exactly at that rate, well, what does that mean for crossing temperature thresholds in the future? And it basically has us formally crossing 1.5 degrees in 2026. It has us crossing 2 degrees. So he looks at it across all of the main groups that measure temperature increases across America and Europe. And it basically has us, the average of those, have us crossing 2.5 degrees by 2048 and 3 degrees by 2060. The problem with that, and this assumes that rate of increase in temperatures carries on the way it is. There's two other scenarios that could happen. It could be the case that is a short-term thing and that it returns to a lower rate of warming in the future. If this happens to be something that's
a blip,
going on, a blip for a point of time. If it's to do with a reduction in aerosols, for instance, that doesn't carry on forever at the same rate. So one possibility is that it stops growing at that rate. Another possibility is it carries on. The temperatures go up at that rate, decade on decade. A third possibility is that the acceleration keeps going and things happen even faster than this. So the mid-road is that they carry on at the rate that we're now detecting. That gets us to 2.5 degrees at least by 2050. The problem with that is if you lay that across the planetary solvency dashboard that has been put together by
planetary solvency dashboard.
Yeah, planetary solvency dashboard. This is the
that sounds like something Bernard would create about, national debt.
Oh, I love that idea.
It's the dashboard put together looking at climate risk from the UK actuaries, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, along with the University of Exeter, saying, well, what do different temperature increases mean for society? What does that actually imply? And they, in their framework, if you get over 2.5 degrees by 2050, they put that as in the catastrophic category where you basically lose about 25% GDP losses by then, 25% human mortality, so that's 2 billion people off the planet's population.
Well, that'll solve the problem.
If you go over 3 degrees by, I don't know what problem is. I would suggest that at that level, if you have 2 billion people lost from the planet's population, that doesn't seem hugely consistent.
It's going to make tourism very difficult.
Yeah, it's going to make organised civilization very difficult. Yeah. I would suggest at that rate.
That's one of the problems. It's never a clean process, and it usually involves some sort of major conflict. So it's and as we've seen in the you go.
So also there was another paper that I've just been looking at that is looking specifically at climate sensitivity. So this is how much does the temperature double when you double CO2 in the atmosphere. That new paper has come out and it is basing its estimates on the satellite data, the Ceres satellite. And it's basically coming back saying that, so within the IPCC, the estimates for climate sensitivity sit between A likely scenario is between 2.5 and 4 degrees, so they usually sit at somewhere around 3. Now, this paper is saying they now believe, based on the satellite data, which is a little more accurate than models, using models to estimate the stuff, that the lower constraint sits around 2.93 degrees. So that's the lowest possible constraint, and it goes up, the range goes up higher than that. What that actually does is a whole lot of the models that the IPCC uses, they sit underneath that constraint.
Yeah.
So it basically says they're wrong.
So, Catherine, are you just scaring the shit out of our audience today? Because I'm getting some feedback, of course, about the 2 billion thing, which is, I mean, just you do have those people who say, we've got too many people and the real problem is overpopulation. Is there anything positive that you could bring our audience ahead of the Matariki weekend?
The most positive thing I would be saying to people is that you really need to think about your relationships and your community, who is in your community and how you build those relationships. Because, in any of these futures that happen, it's not like everybody, dies and that's the end of the world. People will be living through this stuff.
Distress and
Yeah, and there will even be, in the past, when civilizations have collapsed, there have been some groups, some populations that have actually thrived during those periods. So it's, it won't be, I guess, thriving through this series of rapid change that's going to happen in the coming decades, which is pretty much a given that there will be rapid change. Your ability to live and thrive through that will depend on what kind of community you have around you, and so Matariki weekend is a good time to start thinking about that.
Absolutely. And, you can see this from a positive point of view for Aotearoa, that we are probably the best climate refuge in the world. We are as far away from anyone as you can possibly get. Our moat is bigger than anyone else's. And we're going to be in a better position than most, and it'd be in lots of demand. The question is, how much demand do we want?
I think there are definitely worse places to be, but I would also caution that, there's been a lot of, there were all those articles in the US about where was the best place in the US to go as a climate refuge, and then the one that they picked out got completely flooded out by that last hurricane that happened and went inland. So things change. Where you are geographically is not necessarily the thing I would focus on. What you need to focus on is who you're there with. So what are your community relationships? I think that's what makes you more resilient. Things could happen anywhere, and we don't necessarily know exactly. What
next
the
week,
path
let's
is gonna
do. So David Moring, who often comes on, of course, is mentioning, and he's right about CFCs and so on in the ozone layer. Let's come on next week and do at least 60 seconds of positivity, because I also read a piece today about a Nature report which shows that I think food production in the Midwest in the United States is going to fall by 13%. But thank you, Catherine. That's really sweet of you. Will you stay on if you want to in the background? We're bringing in our 3 experts, and people are already complaining that they haven't had enough time to speak, which they haven't even spoken yet.
I'll let Simon shuffle the deck. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
So look, let me introduce the international section, Bernard. We've got 3 really terrific people. Well, we already know that Robert Patman is terrific. We've got an old colleague of mine, Jonathan Lyons, is coming on. Jonathan was the bureau chief at Reuters in Tehran when I was a news editor at Reuters, and he's also a historian, has written some pretty amazing books, which I'm desperate to download, about Islam, about Iran. And then we've got Anthony Lowenstein, who is an Australian journalist. Have we lost them, actually? Have those buggers accidentally lost them? Somebody's got... This is why we do the podcast separately. But we've got Anthony Lowenstein, who is an Australian journalist, a severe critic of Israeli policy. Anthony, I was just saying you're a severe critic of Australian policy.
Yes, I can hear that. Thank you,
of
Peter.
Israeli
Charming,
policy.
Yes.
It's great to have you there. You're an author and a filmmaker, and I've interviewed you a couple of times for the listener. And of course, we've got Robert Patman. What I'm going to try to do, partly because of the editing of this later for a podcast by our lovely editor Simon, is I'm going to go first to Jonathan. And just say, Jonathan, you're a genuine expert on Iran, on Islam, on the schisms in Islam. Would you give us a little bit of a perspective on how you see contemporary Iran relative to the history that we've come from? And I guess your perspective goes beyond the Islamic Revolution with Ayatollah Khomeini.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'd actually deflect that question just a tiny bit, or bend it perhaps, and let's look at the Western idea of the history of Iran, or the history of Islam. And Iran, of course, is an Islamic country. And to do that, we have to go back 1,000 years at least. So we go back to the Crusades, when an idea of Islam was formulated essentially as wartime propaganda. And it posited that the Muslims were the antithesis of the Christian world. So Islam was a religion of hate, Christianity was a religion of love. Islam was a religion of war, Christianity was a religion of peace. Islam was a religion of falsehood, Christianity was a religion of eternal truth. What's amazing and interesting, and I have documented this extensively in my research, is the degree to which this dichotomy, this binary view, has persisted for 1,000 years in various forms. And so as a result, if we're going to look at Iran and understand what's going on today, we have to look at ourselves and our own view of the Islamic world, and the degree to which we are not really seeing, perhaps, an Islamic world or Iran as a representative, but a discourse of Iran and Islamic, and I call it in my work the anti-Islam discourse. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle I think that's relevant to today, of course, is a more recent history, perhaps dating to the Islamic Revolution, and particularly the hostage-taking and humiliation of the great Satan, the United States.
Yeah.
And the fact that Iran has...
Back in 1979.
Right, and the fact that Iran has persisted as the leading voice, and perhaps the most powerful voice, of opposition to American presence in the Middle East. So Iran is suffering from two original sins in the Western view. One is its implacable opposition to Western domination across the Middle East, and of course, we're talking oil, geopolitics in general, but also its status as an exemplar of an Islamic culture with a great deal of power, a large population, incredibly educated, sophisticated place. So I think we need to look at those two components to try to figure out how that tells us why what Iran does might be seen differently than what some other states.
Yeah, Jonathan, it's really, we seldom go back 1,000 years on this podcast, because you and I were talking the other day about how ephemeral journalism is. But I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things we talked about was that book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. And your book, one of your books, Islam Through Western Eyes, looks absolutely fascinating in that. And I was thinking about this for this funny New Zealand audience we've got. We still have, believe it or not, a rugby team in Christchurch in New Zealand called the Crusaders. And they ride onto they have a promotion where they ride onto the field every weekend with crosses of St. George. I mean, and then I looked at that ludicrous piece with Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, realizing that Ted Cruz was possibly the most unappealing person who could ever have stood for president. But this idea of Iran as a demon, as a sort of cardboard cutout of everything bad in the world, and I guess it goes back also to Reagan's axis of evil. But does it from America's point of view, does it go back to the embarrassment of the embassy siege?
I think that has a lot to do with it in official Washington, in military and diplomatic circles. That was, obviously it was beyond the pale. It was a clear violation of international law, and we understand that. But I guess the question that I would want our audience to think about is, what do these two factors, the demonization post-79 and the 1,000-year history of looking at the Islamic world in a certain discursive way, what do those blind us to? And what they blind us to, in my mind, is the fact that Iran has, like any state, has legitimate state interests. Self-defense would be one of them. Iran is not a monolithic society. we get a very adulterated or a very filtered version because it's very hard to access. I was lucky enough to, as you said, to have been a correspondent based there. And I met and interviewed many senior religious figures who were not in the government. And what I learned was the degree to which the quietest opposition to what's going on in Iran, to a political theocracy, is very significant and is waiting in the wings, as are old line leftists and liberal Democrats. So we tend not to see that, partly because the state is so effective at broadcasting and controlling its vision. So what don't we see? We don't see that. We don't see that Shia Islam, in my view, has room for a democratic reform and even a liberal democratic
Do you think
system.
Shia more than Sunni? Because that's a very interesting perspective, and I would have thought maybe that's true, actually, now that I think about it.
Well, without getting too much into the theological minutiae, one of the telling aspects of Shiism is that every Shia believer is free to choose a religious authority based on that religious authority's opinions and written views and direct appeals. And so because you're born in Iran and you're a Shia, you could still follow an Ayatollah in Kuwait, in Qatar, in the UK. And if you don't like an Ayatollah's ruling, you can shop around. So, and the way that these Ayatollahs achieve prestige and status is kind of almost like an election, because how many followers do you have? You have followers, they make donations, you support your seminary students. And so, well, it's not a democratic election. It's quite transparent in many ways. So I think the last point I would make is this system, these issues, this discourse blinds us to the fact that if we could anonymize the activities of Iran somehow and say, here's a state that feels under stress from many, many sources, that has the scientific wherewithal to build an atomic bomb, maybe they should build an atomic bomb from their standpoint. I mean, you can understand it, but to say, no, they're the most evil source of instability. And of course, I guess it was really interesting today, a major media outlet had an op-ed praising Israel, which has not signed the non-proliferation treaty, which has an atomic bomb, nuclear force. I mean, it's denied, but it's well known. Acting with the approval of this columnist and his media backers as the policeman of the nuclear proliferation business. It's absurd.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It's absurd.
Jonathan,
but the question is, why don't we ask that?
That's the perfect segue for me to go to Anthony Lowenstein. Now, Jonathan, thank you. Everybody's loving hearing this erudite perspective, but also sharp. Anthony, you're a severe critic, I described you, I think, of current Israeli policy. You've written this amazing book about the military-industrial complex, the surveillance complex, but you're presumably, I've looked at your Substack today, you're thinking even further than that about what Israel is doing and the way it does these, for some reason the word ostentatious, but also brave, skillful, and so on interventions go. Would you give us your perspective on this before we then ask Robert to wrap it up, and then I'll come back to a more three-way conversation and bring Bernard in as well, please.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and hello everybody. I think we're at a unbelievably precarious moment. I'm not sure if I'd use the word audacious. I mean, yes, obviously what Israel has done in the last 20 months in terms of decapitating Hezbollah, which obviously, as we now know, has gone back for years in terms of their ability to infiltrate Hezbollah's communication system, their ability to kill many Iranian senior military leaders in the first 24 hours. All that, yes, is evidence of skill. But as I've been saying for many years, and this long before October 7, but certainly since, it operates under the delusion that Israel and many of its blind supporters have, that it's bringing them some kind of security or stability. It's actually bringing the opposite. They might believe that by knocking out the leader of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is now existing, but certainly much weaker than it was, Hamas is still standing, but obviously bloodied. The Iranian situation, like anyone, is utterly unpredictable where this is going to go. Is this a regime change operation? It certainly feels that way, but I'm skeptical whether many Iranians actually would support the concept, speaking to people I know on the ground, that the US and Israel would be backing such a plan and pushing for it, considering the record of US intervention in the last 20 years, which has been, to a country, an utter disaster. And in fact, there was another story in The Guardian which said, for the millionth time, but it's worth repeating, there is no plan here. There's no plan. There's no plan if the regime falls. Either the supreme leader is killed, or who knows, a multitude of possibilities, this regime collapses. So you have 90 plus million people hoping what? That Netanyahu or Trump have their interests at hand? Trump wouldn't even know where Iran was on the map. I mean, he hasn't got the focus to imagine something longer than 5 minutes. He loves the idea that Israel, inverted commas, is winning, and therefore he's looking to sort of jump on the back of it. But the ultimate situation, and I'll finish with this, is that, and I say this to someone...
You think you'll finish with it? You haven't heard my questions yet.
No, I know. Well, I'll finish this point. Is that, longer term, Israel is facing a profound existential crisis. And it might not accept that now. And what I mean by that is that none of these activities, not least the genocide in Gaza, but beyond, is actually bringing Israel closer to what I think is a likely future, which is a theocratic Jewish Taliban-style state. This is where Israel is headed. It's not inevitable, it's not guaranteed. There are obviously a lot of Israeli Jews, let alone Palestinians, of course, who oppose that possibility. But all the demographic trends suggest that that's a very likely outcome. And that puts Israel in a bit of a problem, because their whole raison d'etre is, well, there's thriving democracy in the Middle East. Now, will some states still back them? Yes, probably. Will the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand? Maybe, possibly, who knows?
It becomes much harder to back a theocratic state if that's... I mean, it's a slightly outlandish, but not completely outlandish
It's not really.
idea.
How's it outlandish?
Well,
That's literally... It's not outlandish at all. In fact, that's the direction Israel's been heading for 20, 30 years. I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, just to be clear. But demographically, liberal Jews are having no babies. Orthodox religious Jews are. It's just a demographic game. That's as simple as that. And more Israeli Jews are leaving. The idea that huge amounts of Jews are going to come into Israel to bolster the numbers is delusional. Now, when Israel talks about trying to get up to 2 million settlers in the West Bank, which is what they're saying now, it's not even 1 million now, but let's say they want to get to 2 million, the only way you can do that demographically is to allow and accept evangelical Christians as settlers in large numbers who are not Jews.
Which is the Huckabee solution to all of this.
Indeed,
which we'll
it
get
is.
to in a second. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Anthony, you mentioned you used the word existential, and I just want to, you used it before I was going to use it. Israel constantly or regularly talks about its existential threat, which then, and this is before I'm going to segue in a minute after I've let you answer the existential question to Robert, but this idea that allows preemptive attack, you don't know what we're facing. I mean, it does face an existential threat, but you turned it the other way. Well, external forces, let's say
there are some in the Arab world who hate Israel. I mean, that's true. I wouldn't say it's an existential threat, but yes. Worsened, by the way, since October 7, but yes, go on.
No, you go on.
Well,
so,
I mean...
Do we, Netanyahu and so on will say, we face an existential threat, we do, went back to it goes back always to the Holocaust, which is, that was an existential threat and an appalling thing. Yet we sort of apologise for it away, or there's a kind of understanding that we accept that existential threat as a justification.
Well, maybe some people do. I certainly don't. I don't deny that there are threats to Israel, in inverted commas. I think there are Arab elements, some Muslim elements, others who loathe Israel long before October 7. I think that's the statement of fact. I don't think it's existential. When I talk about existential, putting aside the fact that there's a possibility, I think a real possibility of theocratic future for Israel, I'm talking about the threat of legitimacy. And what Israel
you mean
is
that they're jeopardizing their own legitimacy?
Indeed. Israel has always craved, since day one, legitimacy. I'm not talking about militarily. I'm talking about legitimacy in the West, where they need to have that support to continue their project militarily, politically, socially, diplomatically. And since October 7, and there's been a lot of polling in the last few months across the US, UK, Europe, Australia, I don't know about New Zealand, and Israel's support's falling off a cliff. Now, would that change if the war in Gaza comes to an end? Yeah. Maybe, possibly, it might go up a little bit. This is the existential threat of legitimacy that Israel faces.
Which is interesting that that's, you know, your view is very similar to what a much more conservative, I would say, Jewish journalist commentator Thomas Friedman said, which we've dealt with, and we have looked at that YouGov
I can't
survey.
believe Petey just compared me to bloody
Yeah, exactly.
Thomas Friedman.
No, you're in the same. You're in the same. You're in the same barbed wire canoe trying to sail up the creek. I'm going to bring Robert in now. Robert, what do you think about what you've heard? We know, again, this week we've pushed you slightly to the side to bring us this international affairs and then New Zealand perspective to this. What do you think about what you've heard from
really
these two chaps?
enjoyed Jonathan and Anthony's contributions. I'm big admirers of both of them. And, you know, I think I just want to focus a little bit on something Anthony said. I think we're at an incredibly dangerous moment, stating the obvious. But one of the things I find particularly disturbing is the fact that so many liberal democracies, we can all accept that the United States had a sort of a domestic political problem when it comes to standing up to Israel. US presidents are not very good at it. I think the last one really did it was Eisenhower in 1956. What was this, you know, so I didn't expect Trump to have an Eisenhower moment when the Israeli attack sabotaged the negotiations that the Trump administration was purportedly having with the Iranian government. But what really disappoints me, and I listened to Frederick Mertz's comments, that along the lines, and this has been echoed by Starmer in the UK, along the lines that Netanyahu is actually doing the dirty work for the other liberal democracies of removing this dark force from Iran. It's complete nonsense. They know full well that Netanyahu has been steadfastly opposing the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which they all say they stand for, and of course the Trump administration has now moved away from. But I mean, who are they really? I mean, do they seriously think this is going to be bought by their own electorates? Because it seems to me this is extraordinary hypocrisy. And as I say, I do understand the US is always paralysed. It has been in recent times anyway, when it comes to matters relating to Israel. But there seems to be an utter lack of courage at the moment, other liberal democracies, to say what is the obvious thing. I've got absolutely no brief for the current, the clerical regime in Tehran. But at the same time, when you look at this situation, it's quite clear who is the aggressor and who is the victim. And it's ridiculous to pretend otherwise.
Jonathan, Bernard has a question for Bernard from France is desperate to talk to Jonathan in Vancouver, or near Vancouver.
Jonathan, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I'm very interested in your comments about the potential opposition forces within Iran, because Israel and the United States seem to realistically think that there could be regime change, and it raises the prospect, well, maybe there are some opposition forces that could do a nice, clean, simple regime change. But what's your view on whether that's realistic?
I don't think it's realistic at this stage. I think what we have to realize is that Iran has a long, serious political culture. And so I could see if the regime, and I assume regime change in the context of Israel and Washington means the death of Khamenei. If that's regime change, that's just substituting one personality for another. But I think it would open up the possibilities that the political culture of Iran could sort of be revived. Because one thing I have learned in my work and as a journalist is the longevity of some of these ideas that they seem buried. I mean, I was also, in addition to Tehran, I covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at the time, at least, and Putin, of course, has taken a bit of a detour, but it seemed that it was actually a return in some ways. The return of the church, for example. The church had sort of been dead and buried by the Soviets, but it hadn't. it turned out to be very vital. And so I don't know where the opposition would come. Obviously, the old liberal Democrats, some of whom I was able to interview for a book that I wrote, must have passed away by now. I'm persona non grata in the Islamic Republic, and even if I weren't, I've sort of moved on in some ways.
I think I remember
so I
when
can't
that
say
happened,
that I
actually.
have. I'm sorry, Peter?
I think I remember when that might have happened. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So I don't have on the ground knowledge now, so I have to beg off that part of the question. But what I do know is that certainly in the seminaries, there is a lot of quietist opposition. So if I could briefly segue into Shia theology once again. In the Shia worldview, historically, political power is illegitimate. The role of the clerics is to kind of push the state to do the right thing at moments of crisis, and then retire into the seminaries and do their highly intellectualized theological exegesis and issuing of opinions to guide the faithful. And the next time there's a crisis and the society's in real trouble, they might come out of the seminary and push the government again. But to get your hands dirty with government soils the religion.
Interesting.
Khomeini comes along, and he's not the political radical we would depict him. He's a religious radical. He has completely turns Shia jurisprudence on its head by putting a clerical regime in place. And there are many senior clerics who maybe very quietly behind the scenes would cheer the collapse of that system. That being said, I think some of the other guests have made the point that it's very unlikely that a decapitated Iran would somehow find cheer.
Transform into a democracy overnight.
Or that America and Israel would be welcomed. I mean, there's a nationalism trend, as in China, as in all these countries, that we tend to overlook. As it's not a cartoon country. These are not cartoon figures. These are real people with real ideas. But if I could just say one other thing in support of Anthony. In the 1990s, I sat in the American Colony Bar in Jerusalem with a fellow journalist, and we planned to write a book called The Ayatollahs of Ben Yehuda Street. And we saw the same thing, and we were living in Iran then. And so Ayatollahs were prominent, and we thought, okay, there is a religious, so it's not far-fetched.
Well, no, you're giving us such great perspective. Anthony, may I ask you a question? Which, I'm sure you have a response to that, and you can squeeze that in at the beginning. But the question is also about how do we, if we see what Netanyahu is very successfully doing, and he's been doing it for the last 13 of the last 20 years or 15 of the last 20 years as he's been Prime Minister, it's very difficult to look at how he's leading Trump to some extent, pushing Trump's buttons, without getting into some anti-Semitic tropes about Israel running the world. How do we deal with that? And I did watch your amazing evidence today to the New South Wales anti-Semitism inquiry.
Thank you. I should say, Jonathan, I used to live for many years down the road from the American colony in Jerusalem, so that place is still thriving, although I understand because the last years it's suffering like everywhere there economically because less tourists are going. I think the way we speak about Israeli power, Jewish power, has to be done cautiously. I think at the same time it's not exactly controversial or outrageous to suggest that there are many forces within the US that are often paid by AIPAC to do Israel's bidding. I don't think that's exactly controversial to say. It's just a statement of fact, has been for years. One of the things I think is worth saying, though, for viewers to really understand here is that, as I've said for a long time, again, long before October 7, the issues in Israel go far beyond Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not the issue. It's like the US. The issues in the US are not solely about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a symptom, obviously, of a much bigger picture, a bigger problem. I mean, for example, as I've said for a long time, one looks at the polling within Israel before October 7, but certainly since. I do not think there is any other Western state, if you can say Israel's a Western state, I would question that, but let's say for argument's sake it is, that has as much genocidal mania in a mainstream way. What I mean by that is there is polling in the last months that found a majority of Israeli Jews, not Palestinians of course, Israeli Jews that support violent ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Now, there's racism in every country, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. I'm not denying that. There's often been genocide in other countries. I'm not denying that either. But the idea that somehow when and if Netanyahu falls as leader, which obviously eventually he will, Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, whoever other cretin decides to take over, if anyone honestly believes...
That's very rude about cretins, but thank you. Cretins, rather.
I had a run-in with Lapid years ago, so I have no time for him. But let's put that issue aside. If anyone believes that the problem in Israel suddenly changes or there's more openness to Palestinians, you are delusional. The issue is not Netanyahu. There's a certain mystique around him and certainly a degree of, as people say, like a poison machine around him, which he has successfully pursued for years. I'm not denying any of that, and he's a malignant figure. But the broader questions that Israel faces are not going to be dealt with properly with a Lapid or Bennett, because these key issues, there is general agreement. There's complete agreement mostly on Gaza. There's mostly agreement on Iran. There's mostly agreement on the West Bank. Where is the fundamental difference? Maybe you wouldn't have a Ben Gvir in government. Okay, so one less fanatic. But in general, it is a similar policy. The issue is not Netanyahu, it's the wider Israeli society, which finally means without outside pressure, this is never going to change. It's not going to come from within.
But how do we deal? How do we deal, please, with the, because it's a question I like. Well, I could actually ask you. Yeah. How do we deal with this idea that the tail is wagging the dog, and without then going into tropes about Jewish control of the world? Because these are real issues. The anti-Semitism is real.
Yes.
You start to see, people on the margins. You see it in pro-Palestinian demonstrations where, there's some pretty bad shit out there as well.
I mean, there is, but I would say that according to every single study on this issue, the vast, vast, vast bulk of anti-Semitic, racist actions and words are on the far right. There's just no question about that. I'm not denying it doesn't exist on the left. It does in some sections. I'm not denying that. But in every country where this has been assessed, US, UK, Australia, it's the far right. I think when we talk about this, we need to explain that, or acknowledge that not all the criticism of Israel is based on simply criticising the policy, that there are elements of animus towards Jews, which exists, it's real. I think anti-Semitism is something that needs to be acknowledged and fought. The problem to me is that we have, and I say this as someone who's Jewish myself, there is a civil war going on within the Jewish communities, US, UK, Canada, Europe, etc. That's a non-violent civil war, thankfully, so far. What I mean by that is, in general, it's not quite as simple as this, but in general, younger Jews are generally far, far, far more critical of Israel and simply don't have anything to do with it, and older Jews are in general far more supportive. It's not quite as neat as that, but that's generally what the statistics are showing. Now, the impact of that practically is that when you have growing numbers of prominent Jewish groups in the US, Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, and others who are saying, we are Jews, and we are talking about how Jewish power and our leadership is failing so miserably to acknowledge what Israel is doing to all of us, that Israeli actions are making us more unsafe, that it's more unsafe to be a Jew in Israel, the supposed homeland of Jews, than any other country in the world. What does that say to you about the supposed homeland?
Yeah, so, which was your position to the New South Wales?
Indeed, which is, I mean, to me, it's just a statement of fact. I don't know anyone can honestly deny that. So, yes, we need to be cautious in how we speak about the implementation of Israeli or Jewish power, but at the same time, let's speak honestly about what is going on here. The fact that Israel is doing this by bullying, by leading Trump by the nose, whatever language you want to use, Trump is, as I said, on these issues has no idea what's going on. He's being led and pressured and bullied and whatever is going on behind the scenes. There's obviously a split within MAGA itself. You have Tucker Carlson, who I think has been a crank for years, is now doing some of the most interesting interviews with Ted Cruz I've ever seen in my life. So God knows what's going on there.
Who also is a crank. So yeah,
absolutely.
I watched it today, and I almost don't want to talk about it because I think Tucker Carlson is a lunatic, and I think Cruz proved himself to be a lunatic.
He is.
And not to be taken seriously on this podcast.
All that's true, Peter, but just briefly, it's worth saying, the questions that Carlson is asking are legitimate questions about how the US views Israel.
What you're looking at? Yeah.
It's a legitimate question to ask. The fact it's coming, the messenger might not be great, but the questions are legitimate.
Yeah, I thought it was the classic politician one. How much is a bottle of milk? Robert, may I come to you on this? You've heard a lot from these two gentlemen. Where do we stand in New Zealand on this? You know, we have you talked about you've talked repeatedly about the risks of being closer to the United States, but it's our historic ally. What do you think about what you've heard? And I also wonder whether you, in the absence of Teresa Dunworth, might discuss the international law aspects of what Israel did with Iran the other day.
Well, thank you. I just want to briefly challenge something you said earlier, Peter.
Jesus
about
Christ.
the audacious success of Netanyahu. Because
I know.
I want to
Thank
reinforce.
God. Thank you, Robert. Bloody hell,
I reinforce
Peter.
something Anthony said. Actually, Netanyahu, and I fully agree with Anthony said it's not all down to Netanyahu. But put it this way, Netanyahu has been the symptom of an expression of about how to achieve greater security for Israel, and it was his influence that led to the disastrous, partly his influence that led to the disastrous invasion of Iraq in 2003, which one advisor, former advisor, William Odom, described, former advisor to President Reagan, described as the greatest strategic and political disaster in America's history. And once again, it seems that an Israeli leader, Mr. Netanyahu, again, is having quite decisive influence. And so I'm not sure how successful Mr. Netanyahu has been, because it seems to me, I very much agree with Anthony, the current course of Israel's national security policy seems to be a recipe for perhaps achieving a breathing space in security terms, but a recipe for multiplying the number of enemies that Israel has in the neighborhood where it lives, which can't be in the good long-term interest of the country. So, I think that's important to establish. I'm with regard to the New Zealand perspective, I'm not sure Jonathan and Anthony are aware of this, but New Zealand actually was one of the first countries, along with Ireland, amongst the so-called Western countries, to push for a peaceful a ceasefire in Gaza. They voted for an immediate humanitarian truce on, I think, 27th October 2023. But it's been a sort of Jekyll and Hyde performance, or schizophrenic performance, by the New Zealand government. Within the UN, they've been doing the right things. Outside it, they've been incredibly low-key and not prepared to criticise the United States when the United States was opposing New Zealand's diplomacy inside the UN. I was disappointed when by New Zealand's performance outside the UN. And what I mean by that is, on Gaza, when Israel reneged on the ceasefire with Hamas, left it, and then imposed this horrific humanitarian blockade. The foreign minister's response was, when he was asked about this, that he needed more time to get the facts. And we didn't hear back from him. And yesterday, I think it was yesterday, he said, with regard to the the Israeli attack on Iran, that there was no innocent party in this situation. So it seemed that he was saying, and I hope I'm not putting words into his mouth, that New Zealand was neutral on this issue. Now, as a liberal democracy, and small countries and middle powers do actually need a rules-based order, because they're not big enough to throw their weight around. That's how they do business in the world, amongst other things. It seemed to me a major departure from New Zealand's long-standing support for international relations based on a vision of rules, principles, and procedures. Because if you remain neutral on what is a blatant, aggressive act on very dubious grounds, because all accounts, according to US intelligence and IAEA, Iran is quite a way short at the moment of having a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she says.
If we accept that we're neutral on an issue where there's a blatant disregard and violation of international law, then I think that's a really negative look for New Zealand internationally. I think it's one issue where New Zealand should be speaking up and saying this is completely unacceptable what Israel's doing, because it's setting itself up as judge and jury of a neighbouring country. And I think that's completely inappropriate. One other thing I'd like to say.
Sorry, go ahead, because we're nearly.
No, sorry, just quickly.
No. I've decided that we're going to talk for the next 3 days. It's going to be like a telethon.
Oh,
carry on.
But
Robert.
just one quick point, because Jonathan and Nancy
please.
be getting sick of my
Robert,
voice.
Poor old Bernard has a question as well.
I found the Chinese response to what's happening very interesting. And they've hardened their support for Iran in the last 2 days or so. Said it was a blatant violation by the Israelis, and it was unacceptable. And it's interesting to me, because that might just actually register what's going on in Washington. That they could, if the United States, the assumption is that if America piles in behind Israel, it can be quickly over. I'm not sure that's going to be true. And the other final point I would make is that, again, coming back to this success point, inverted commas, Peter, I think the Iranian response, I'm not a strategic specialist, but it seems to me the Iranian response using missiles at times to penetrate the dome system has come as a bit of a shock to some. The fact that they could target Mossad headquarters in a suburb of Tel Aviv, I think was a bit of a surprise. So it may be that Netanyahu is now looking almost desperately for US to come in, because the whole thing is beginning to escalate in a way that he perhaps hadn't imagined.
Robert, Bernard is going to come in and ask a sort of a quick fire round. But poor old Anthony's been bullied by me for weeks about coming on, so I'm so glad you agreed to do it.
I mean, almost in almost anti-Semitic ways. I'm just going to say that, Peter.
In what?
But I'm almost anti-Semitic ways. But I'm here. I mean, firstly, I was basically. I'm like Thomas Friedman. God help us.
No.
Oh my God.
And also, Jonathan, I think we're going to need you on again, because the audience is going wild for your perspective. So we may well come back to you. But Bernard has a sort of quick fire conversation for the three of you, or question for the three of you, I think.
Just to wrap up, because we've got one final guest.
Yes, thank you.
Shortly. Anthony and Jonathan and Robert, just very quick answers, if you could, on.
Yes.
How this ends, what are the possible outcomes here, particularly if the United States gets involved and does its bunker busting?
You're talking about particularly with Israel and Iran, I guess, when you say ending. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So, Anthony, yep.
I mean, on one hand, I'm not going to not give you an answer, but the unknown is, does it end with the regime collapsing? I mean, obviously, if it does not, the Islamic Republic somehow survives, staggers on. If it's going to be akin to like Hezbollah, which is still breathing in Lebanon, but clearly massively damaged, I think you will find that a lot of Israelis and its supporters will feel very unsatisfied with the outcome, even if the bunker buster bombs are used against the alleged nuclear. I mean, I was reading today in The Guardian suggesting that some say the only way to destroy those nuclear capacity is with a tactical nuclear weapon. And you're thinking, okay, is that on the table? I mean, they sort of slid that into a comment. I was like, hang on a minute, what? So, I mean, the short answer is, if the regime is overthrown or collapses in a way, I think there is a real risk of balkanization and a Libya-style outcome where there are various groups within Iran that are going to want to carve out their own territory, the Kurds particularly and others. And there's a desire by the US and Israel to balkanize. I mean, there was an editorial in the Jerusalem Post today calling for Iran to be like Libya. This was the supposed vision.
Oh, that's a good solution, yeah.
So I guess my answer is not black or white, but I think either way, it's really unstable. That's my answer.
Jonathan?
Thank you.
And we will have you back. I'm so grateful for you coming on.
Oh,
Carry
thank
on.
you. That's very kind. Not really my field, but I'm going to reach for an analogy and say if any of the players, the U.S., Israel, etc., think that a war against Iran would somehow go as well as the war in Iraq, they have another thing coming. We're talking about a unified, sophisticated, technologically astute system that is deeply embedded across such a large area. There's a major military, and Robert pointed out, able to hit the Mossad headquarters. I don't think the Iraqis could have dreamt of hitting Langley. I think one thing that has occurred to me is it's pretty likely this bunker buster isn't going to do what everyone says it's going to do, and then the U.S. has lost
before.
the U.S. will have lost the advantage of having this super weapon that can always pull out because you can only use it once. If it doesn't work,
Well, remember Moab,
yeah, you have nothing.
the mother of all bombs. This is the successor, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So no, it's not really. I'm not engaged in the geopolitics. I'm not connected to the Pentagon anymore. I'm no longer a Washington. I'm based on a little island in Western Canada off the coast.
Very wise.
I sort of do my reading and my thinking, but my knowledge of Iran and nationalism is very, very deeply ingrained. It's a unified state. Okay, it has Kurdish issues. It has Arabs. In part of the provinces, but it's a an Armenian population, small Jewish population, but it's a unified state. They will rally around the flag, I am convinced. And
Jonathan, thank you so
it would
much
be
for that.
insane.
Robert, do you want to have a last insert
Yes,
into this
I
before
do
we
not
go
think
to our domestic
the
section?
Israelis and
I
the
do
United
apologise.
States will be successful, and I think even if they use their bunker busting bomb and it was successful, it will still incentivize Iran in the future to go for the very thing Israel doesn't want, which is a nuclear weapons capability.
Yep.
And they withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2017, and they've again closed the door on a diplomatic solution. I think many people in both Israel and the United States will rue the day that they tried to use force to dissuade Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, because I think that's exactly what it's going to achieve. They're going to
That's profound.
incentivize
Robert,
Iran
that's
to move in that
brilliant.
direction.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much. Anthony, thanks for coming on. I'm sorry I bullied you to come on again, but actually I'm not. It's so great to have you there. Jonathan,
Thanks for having me.
It's very late where you are. Really appreciate you coming on. And Bernard's now going to take over with Andrea. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you, Andrea, for bearing with us for a late start to your section. I really appreciate it. We had hoped to get you on
It's
a
my
couple of weeks
fault,
ago.
Andrea.
I blame Peter. Andrea, it's fantastic to see you. Thank you very much. We tried to get you on a couple of weeks ago, but I had some tech issues. But wonderful that you're here, because you've written a really interesting op-ed in the Post about investment boost. So we're bringing the story back to New Zealand and our economy, and in particular how we have struggled to get our companies to invest, or our government to invest for that matter, in things that make us more productive. And the government has launched its investment boost policy in the budget, which there's been quite a bit of excitement about, that it might change the game and get people investing in their businesses this time around. But you've had a good look at some of the alternatives. What do you think about this idea that this is a game changer, and that it could mean a big increase in our productivity?
Well, originally I thought it was a form of accelerated depreciation, which technically it kind of is because it's initial expensing. But normally accelerated depreciation is more generous than investment boost, and it tends to be quite targeted to areas that you want to invest in. And normally it's something like property, plant and equipment to a particular type of sector, because quite frankly, normally accelerated depreciation is a form of subsidy. It is intended to distort or change the incentives, but this isn't that. This I conceptualise as effectively a form of company tax cut, because it goes to anyone who is effectively profitable, because you do have to make profits for this to have any value, and it goes to any asset. I originally kind of, I started reasonably positive, although, with all the pay equity stuff, I wasn't happy about this budget. And I thought, are they bringing in accelerated depreciation? And then I read the Inland Revenue fact sheet, and it went to commercial property. And I'm like, what? I don't know how many people here follow commercial property because it lost depreciation under the Nats in about 2010, was brought back as part of the COVID relief by the last government, cancelled again by this government to pay for either the landlord's tax deductions or the tax cuts. And now I think this is better than it's ever been. And I read somewhere that they were, it was officials who'd taken it to them because they didn't want this to be distortionary. And I'm like, well, okay, dude, it won't be distortionary, but once upon a time we cared about having a low wage, high carbon economy, not just necessarily going for growth. And this could have been a mechanism to kind of shift the needle, but really it's a form of company tax cut. Now, to be honest, I'm not a fan of company tax cuts, and if you were to have a company tax cut, this is better, but it's not. Yeah, it's going to do nothing to sort of particularly shift the needle or change any of the dynamics in the New Zealand economy.
Because I saw the Treasury forecasts of what this might do led to only a small increase in GDP over the next 30 years. But there was another idea that came out before the election about an accelerated depreciation option, which you found out through OIA requests might have actually increased GDP quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, this was under the OIA. I found that the last government had put together a possible budget bid. Now, to be fair to them, this didn't go ahead. To be fair to the Nats, they have actually done it. And this was targeted at what were the industry transformation, have I got that right? ITP's industry transformation plan areas that the last government was looking at. And it had the potential of lifting GDP to between 0.23% and 0.78% by 2030. So similar numbers, but much quicker than the current proposal, and 0.61 and 2% by 2040. And again, oil rigs weren't there, commercial property wasn't there, farming wasn't there. It was all really highly targeted at effectively the advanced manufacturing sector, because under the Advanced Manufacturing Industry Transformation Plan, this was a sector that really didn't get government assistance, paid wages 10% above median wage, and actually had, looking at the Industry Transformation Plan that MB put together, had some of the oldest plant and equipment in the economy, and yet it employed lots of people, it paid good wages, it was innovative. So that was one of the recommendations that came out of that ITP and others, alongside things like access to finance for medium-sized firms, improving vocational education, because if you have these great machines, you need actually smart, competent people to run them. Management training was always there. I'm sure New Zealand management, and looking more at circular economy and kind of green type investments.
Andrea, thank you very much. That was a really quick look at that, and I appreciate it. I'll make sure there's a link to your full post in the show notes. It's lovely that you've taken the time to come on, and I appreciate it.
Andrea, thank you so much. I'm sorry we squeezed you with these lunatics from overseas.
Yeah, well, interestingly, my original article that I proposed put labour productivity and compared it to Israel. And then when it
that's
got
interesting.
through, it became Hungary. So the original ITP, which is what I got it from, had us being compared to Israel. So
Gosh, because I normally compare us to Denmark and Ireland.
Sorry, what was that?
I normally compare us in my mind, I'm not an economist, unlike you and Bernard, but to Denmark and Ireland.
Oh, yeah, but they do pretty well.
Yeah, for different reasons. But
Thank you.
No, very interesting. Israel does do an awful lot of investment in high-tech stuff.
Yeah, they don't have very high labour productivity, though.
No, Interesting. Yeah, they have a real housing issue as well. Andrea, thank
Thank
you
you
so
so
much.
much. We'll have you back soon, and we'll give you the 40 minutes that those boys took.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrea.
No
Cheers.
problem at all.
I'll just do a very
Bernard,
quick.
have you got a quick soliloquy?
quick
And then I've got a
soliloquy.
teeny weeny and extremely tasteless skateboarding dog.
Great. We're seeing in our economy this week fresh information that shows that essentially we're going back into if not a recession, then a stagnation in the second half of the year. We got information the last week from the Performance of Manufacturing Index and the Performance of Services Index, so the whole economy, both in contraction in the last month or so, and retail sales down. So the government's proposals to so-called go for growth have actually led to slower growth, with the freezes on investment in housing and construction causing more than 10,000 job losses. And the government's tight fiscal policy really drilling through the economy and slowing it down, even as interest rates fall. And the government's essential strategy, which is to lower interest rates and everything will be fine, is restricted by a couple of things. Firstly, the underlying incentives in the economy to get people investing in businesses haven't been changed, as Andrea points out. And secondly, to do that investment, you probably need to borrow money, and the banks are not lending to businesses. Since COVID, banks have lent over $100 billion through into residential investment, either in properties owned and occupied or owned by households, but less than $5 billion into all of housing and farming. So we're talking, for every $100 lent into housing, just $5 into business investment. So the system isn't working from a government point of view, and it now faces a grinding stagnation or recession going into an election year, and that will be difficult. Peter, your skateboarding dog.
Well, no, also I just noticed that David Seymour was saying that the 0.8% GDP growth was something to be celebrated, Bernard. So,
In the
when
June
you're coming
quarter.
with all this with social nonsense. What?
Yeah, in the June quarter.
Socialist nonsense, I'm sorry.
Sorry, in the March
Yeah.
quarter. So we literally, that is history.
Static.
It's in the rear vision mirror, and the latest figures show that we're headed back towards naught in the June and September quarters. So he may say that, and I have a different perspective. And
Excellent.
I'm glad that I can
We'll
put
get
it
them
out
on.
there.
The little slippery piece of soap. Now, my skateboarding dog is possibly too tasteless, but I'm going to do it, which is about an Indian billionaire, Sanjay Kapoor, who was playing polo last week at the Guards Polo Club in London, who unfortunately swallowed a bee while he was playing polo and died.
Oh no, because he was allergic, or he just
Well,
choked,
just
or-
I mean, I think there was an old lady who swallowed a fly, and I don't know why. But anyway, this didn't go very well for him, and it's very sad. But it is also, I don't know, there's something
there's a
extraordinary
Schadenfreude about it. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of, yeah. Anyway, so I think that one might be too tasteless, but I didn't have another one right now. But the playing polo, swallowing a bee, and dying, just there's something quite poignant rather than tasteless. Let's go there. Poignant rather than tasteless.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much
everybody, and
to
thank
our
you,
audience.
Simon, Jossie, our lovely editor, who's going to be tearing whatever little hair he has out to finish this. And just to explain to everybody, we only have this amount of time for all sorts of reasons. And I think that those three people gave of their time tonight, Anthony, Jonathan, and Robert, of course, in a really elegant way. And I appreciated, from my point of view, the depth that Jonathan brings, the vigor and aggression, in a sense, that Anthony brings, and the wisdom that Robert brings. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, everyone. Until next week, I'm Bernard Hickey. You've been also with Peter Bale on the Hoon. Ka kite anō.